Okay, so we have, I think, one more full week, maybe two, before we take the exam over fiction. And I do, I mean, I tend to make this a pretty long section, and then poetry's pretty long too. But we can talk about a lot of poetry in a given week. So they take less time to read, and yet they, sometimes take longer to talk about. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. And I can always shorten what we have. So if it seems like we're falling behind in poetry, I can always take out a few poems. I always leave that at my own discretion. But hopefully we'll stay on schedule and be able to do the test. The test is going to be a mixture of, mostly I mean, it's going to have a lot of matching, and then and the matching will mostly be character names, those kinds of things. And there might be some literary terms like, when we talk about the plot pyramid or something like that, knowing, and I may actually go over those some when I review for the test to make sure we're all on the same page, just kind of go over what the chapter talked about. But as long as you've read the stories and as long as you've done the chapter, read the chapters, we'll be good. So, but we were talking last time about the horse dealer's daughter, and so we kind of got to the end, and I wanted to make sure and finish it up so that we can, a lot of people in their journals questioned, well, is she really in love with him, or is he really in love with her? And for D.H. Lawrence, the guy who wrote this and many other stories, and honestly, a lot of his books were banned as pornographic at the time that he published them. But he was really looking at, what exactly is, what's the difference between physical attraction and actual love, when you grow, affection grows, what is it that draws people to each other, and what's it on the basis of? And he really was intrigued, especially, and I don't know if you guys have ever read a romance novel. It's one of my weird things that I like to do. I love reading everything. So right now I'm in the midst of a bunch of YA fantasy novels, but I do read a lot of romance. And one of the things that irritates me about romance is so much of their character is based on how beautiful they are or what their hair color is, or and the truth is that's so unimportant in a real world relationship. What they look like matters so little. Their character is what matters more than anything. And so I like books that really make characters clear and really draw you in because of who these people are, not because of what they look like. And D.H. Lawrence absolutely agreed with me. So, she's even, her brothers, the narrator even says, well, she'd be good looking. This is again through the brother's point of view. If she weren't so stubborn looking, if her face weren't fixed in that kind of impassive, unexpressive face. And so it's not like she's 27, so she's much older than the norm. Um, at this time for a woman to get married. She's not exactly super marriageable because she has no money either. But none of that for D.H. Lawrence, none of that matters. And so what draws in the doctor is not how beautiful she is and how glorious her hair is or anything like that. He cannot seem to help looking at her. He can't seem to help following her. He can't, and he doesn't even quite understand his own response. And there are certainly, it's not like love is logical. And so I think what D.H. Lawrence is really trying to bring up is that sometimes you're just drawn to people. You have a natural affinity to certain people. And part of it may also be that Dr. Ferguson senses there's a depth to her that is utterly hidden. She keeps it from everyone around her. She's not highly expressive and super outgoing or something. But have you ever heard the expression still waters run deep? Have you ever heard that?
Yes.
And essentially the phrase is to denote the people who aren't necessarily super outgoing people, but they have a lot of depth to their personality when you get to know them. And I think in some ways that's what happens with these two characters. They're really well fleshed out characters in that we have a very short space of time to know them, and yet there's a lot of their struggle that we understand. We know kind of what situation each one of them is in. We sense the isolation that both of them sort of feel. You know, the doctor knows everyone, but is he really friends with anybody? And even, you know, his exchange with the brothers is, okay, well, bye. You know, it's not, they're ready to go on, move on. And I don't know that they're going to miss him at all. And I think in some ways he senses that. And it's really sad. But the truth is you can work with people for years and they don't know who you are. And they don't ever get inside, underneath the surface of who you are. Even friends don't necessarily know you very well. Even family often doesn't get you. And I think what he's picking up on is how isolated that makes a person. You can be surrounded by people and yet still be utterly alone. And he may be, Dr. Ferguson may actually be sensing the same, an affinity, that there's the same thing going on with her. And so he follows her. And he actually, it's not just that he's being a doctor and he's risking, he's going to save her life. He's risking his own life to do so because he can't swim. And you think, what? He can't swim? Actually, honestly, most people around the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, did not know how to swim. I mean, kids drowned all the time. There were, I mean, it's just so few people really knew how to swim. There are very few people had access to a swimming pool of any kind, and very few people swam in ponds and stuff like that for all sorts of reasons. And so even sailors, if a ship went down, most of the sailors would drown just because they couldn't swim, let alone because they were, even if they were just barely offshore, they couldn't make it to land because they couldn't swim. So that's actually not that uncommon at all. And we get no indication, of course, that she can swim either. So, but he really does risk his life. I mean, he goes under the water, and it takes, to catch her, and it takes a while for him to get his footing back under so he can get out of the water and pull her up. And if he gets stuck, they're both going to drown and they'll just be dead. And everybody will wonder, why in the world did their bodies come drifting out of the pond a few days later? And why, what did they do? What happened? And no one will understand. So, because no one understands either of these people, they're both so isolated. So he is, he takes any struggles. He's already exhausted at the beginning of the day. Now he's done all of his visits, and he's exhausted carrying her. And it's hard to carry practically lifeless body. It is very hard to carry someone who is completely passed out. They become somehow much heavier. And so but he carries her all the way back to her house. At least there was a fire burning in the grate, so they could warm up. But it's only when she's, he essentially he tries to talk to her, and she doesn't really, she's not really responsive for a bit. And then finally he gives her some alcohol and some whiskey, and she immediately it wakes her up for real. And then they go through these little details, what happened. Oh, I walked in the pond, and he'd begun to shudder like one sick. So he's really, I mean, the cold has affected him, and he's already exhausted and sick. And at the same time, there's something else going on. What do you think is it just him succumbing to the cold? But because then the narrator says her eyes remained full on him. He seemed to be going dark in his mind, looking back at her helplessly. But then it says the shuddering became quieter in him. His life came back in him, dark and unknowing, but strong. So she gives him energy. There's something that adds to him just by exchanging glances with her. And this is the second time this has happened. But then, even though his strength has come back, the strange, fretful strain had left him. It's like he's calming down in her presence. They're probably at this point much more intimate than they have ever been. And I don't mean intimate as in like doing anything naughty. I mean intimate as in they've probably exchanged courtesies, you know, and they've probably never honestly even been this physically close, like kind of like sitting next to a person, you know. Mostly, I mean, in the United States, we get this because we have the US is pretty hilarious. We like our space. So even when you talk to people, it's rare that you would like brush arms or something if you're even if you're walking next to them. We keep our yard of space all around us. And Europeans don't do this, although the British kind of do. That's where I think we get it from. But he's probably never stood within 6 or 8 feet of her all this time that he's known the family. And so the exchanges are, they're not just polite either. So she says, was I out of my mind? Which is such a weird thing to say. I mean, how would he know, A? But it's an intimate thing. It's a vulnerable thing to ask, like, am I going crazy type of thing. And he says, maybe for the moment. And she goes, am I out of my mind now? Probably because her perception is changed. And he says, are you? No, I don't see that you are. And then it says it turned his face aside. This is, I know this is a really close reading, but it's so much is happening in, and it's all kind of suggested. So you kind of have to figure out, well, what's he doing that for? And why is that happening? So he turns his face aside and he was afraid now because he felt dazed and felt dimly that her power was stronger than his. Like she's having an effect on him that, and he's not, it freaks him out. She has a power over him. And that's in some ways too, when you fall for people, and D.H. Lawrence does kind of explore some of this in his books, there is a power that you give them. You know, when you are in love with someone, you give them power. And if they abuse it, of course, then it becomes a really toxic relationship. And it can happen. It happens all the time in real life. But what do they do with that power? How do they use it? Do they use it towards your benefit and the benefit of you as a couple, or do they use it selfishly? You know, that kind of question is being asked by, honestly, marriage therapists all over the world too. So, but he's worried because there's a fear of what kind of power she has over him. And he says, can you tell me where I shall find some dry things to put on? He asks. Again, that's going to involve a change of clothing, which is also an intimate thing. And she says, it's like at this point, this is the first time she really even noticed, wait a second, he's wet. Did you dive into the pond for me? And he says, no, I walked in. Of course, he still went in to go get her. But I went in overhead as well. So he does admit that. It's a very stilted conversation. It's very awkward because it's never happened before. And it says, they're silent. He hesitated. He very much wanted to go upstairs and get into dry clothing, but there was another desire in him, and she seemed to hold him. His will seemed to have gone to sleep and left him standing there slack before her. But he felt warm inside himself. He did not shudder at all, though his clothes were sodden. So you could see it as like revving up, he's heating, he's got, I don't know, passion or something, but he's definitely got something. There's something more important than getting on dry clothing. There's that connection with her. And then she asks a very intimate question. Why did you? Why did you pull me out? Why did you walk in there and get me? And he says, I didn't want you to do such a foolish thing. And she says, it wasn't foolish. So she refuses the polite thing. He says, oh, I didn't want you to do something foolish, which is almost joking. And she goes, it wasn't foolish. It was the right thing to do. I knew best then, like killing myself was better. And it's a very honest and vulnerable thing for her to say. And he says, I'll go and shift these wet things, such as, exchange them. But still he had not the power to move out of her presence until she sent him. It was as if she had the life of his body in her hands and he could not extricate himself. Or perhaps he did not want to. This is, remember, at no point is she saying, oh, well, then you need, I'm in love with her. He's not really recognizing that, but there is an absolute affinity and attraction. There's something that's keeping him from leaving. Suddenly she sat up. Then she became aware of her own immediate condition. She felt the blankets around her. She knew her own limbs. And she's a little, freaked out. He stood still with fear. She saw her clothing lying scattered. Because remember, he had to revive her and everything. And then he tried to get her wet clothes off. And so she looks around. She goes, "Who undressed me?" Again, a very intimate act. And she was passed out at the time. He says, "I did, to bring you round." And for some moments she sat and gazed at him awfully, her lips parted. "Do you love me then?" Now it's such a weird question to ask. Do you guys agree? Because when the first time I ever read this, I went, "What?" Like I expected him to go, "What?" Uh, and like, why would you ask that? And because it's such I mean, first of it, it's such a vulnerable question, and it demands so much. And if he says no, gives her the kind of wrinkled stare thing, like, "Ew, no, I don't," that's a total rejection. So it's she's risking a lot by asking the question. But that question, how does he respond to the question? Does he do the head shaking, "No, of course not" thing? He doesn't. I mean, and it's all it's expressed very briefly, and yet what he does is so strange. He only stood and stared at her, fascinated. His soul seemed to melt. She shuffled forward on her knees and put her arms around him, round his legs, as he stood there, pressing her breasts against his knees and thighs, clutching him with a strange, convulsive certainty, pressing his thighs against her, drawing him to her face, her throat. It's like she's desperate to touch him in so many different ways. And she looked up at him with flaring, humble eyes of transfiguration, triumphant in first possession. "You love me. You love me. I know you love me. I know." Like she can sense all of the weird feelings churning through him, and she's interpreting them in this way. And she was suddenly kissing his knees through the wet clothing, passionately. I mean, it's not exactly like, what is the word? It's not exactly pornography. I mean, kissing his knees, like it's such a strange action. And yet, can you imagine it? It didn't seem that weird, I guess. And he says he was amazed, bewildered, and afraid. He had never thought of loving her. He had never wanted to love her. When he rescued and restored her, he was a doctor and she was a patient. He had no single personal thought of her. And at first, he's just like, and he even says he feels like, no, he's not in love with her. It was very distasteful to him, a violation of his professional honor. No, I'm just a doctor. So he was all denial. And this is bad. This is wrong. It's horrible. Um, and yet, and yet, he had not the power to break away. Now, why is that? He says, "Oh, no, I'm just a doctor. I don't actually love her. She shouldn't be kissing my knees. This is not okay. Blah, 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 blah." But he doesn't break away. And it said, and she looks at him with love, that in that same transcendent, frightening light of triumph. And he is, yeah, I mean, it's funny because there are times, I mean, when you even say to people, "So what exactly is love?" I mean, love is not loving everything about a person. Love is filled with, I mean, I've been married over 30 years now, happily married, love my husband, love him. And he is so annoying sometimes, and adorable, and exasperating, and wonderful, and charming, and boring. I mean, people are just a mixture of who they are. Your friends are the same way. No friend, there's no such thing as perfect. And yet you come to be so, he's comfortable and he's encouraging. And, so you can look at, if you say, why do you love a person? It's so many things of who they are. And yet loving a person is scary. It is a really frightening thing to do. And it's a risky thing to do. And there are plenty of people who won't do it. They just refuse. If they feel like they're getting some sort of affinity, they break off because they don't want to give power to someone else. It's a tremendously vulnerable thing to do. And it says he had never intended to love her. He'd never intended, and something stubborn in him could not give way. And he's afraid, and yet he can't say no. And it's not, oh, I don't want to hurt her feelings. There's nothing in here that's that. It's him going, I don't know what this is. What is this? I don't know why I'm drawn to her. I don't know. I didn't intend for this to happen. This wasn't in my plans. He's so afraid, and yet he's still being drawn in. He can't tell her no. And does it feel like guilt? Does it feel like, oh, I'm just going to tell her what she wants to hear? It feels very much like it's not the case. And he could even say, no, I'm not. But he can't say it because he would be denying something that feels real. And so it says, a flame seemed to burn the hand that grasped her soft shoulder. He had no intention. Again, there's the denial. It was horrible, and yet wonderful was the touch of her shoulders, beautiful the shining of her face. He had a horror of yielding to her, yet something in him ached also. And D.H. Lawrence is a guy, and so this could very well be how, especially when men are used to being very much autonomous or thinking that they can do everything independently. Sometimes they may be, he's maybe taking more into his reaction. We get more of the inside of the doctor's brain than we get inside Miss Pervin's, but maybe he's kind of dealing with that there's sometimes a reluctance to give in to one's feelings. And so he's kind of fighting between that horror of yielding to her and giving her that power, and yet aching for that same intimacy. And so he had been staring away at the door, away from her, but his hand remained on her shoulder. She had gone suddenly very still. He looked down at her. Her eyes were now wide with fear, with doubt. The light was dying from her face. A shadow of terrible grayness was returning. So she's fearing now that it's a no. Like, he's going to say, I don't love you. Or he's trying to tell her just in his actions that he doesn't. And that's when he gives in. A sudden gentle smile came on his face, and her eyes, which never left his face, slowly filled with tears. And his heart seemed to burn and melt away in his breast. And so then he presses her face against his throat. It's very intimate. I don't see it. Do you guys see it as pornographic? Please tell me if you do. But they're not like doing anything naughty. He's just touching her in a way that at that time was not socially acceptable. But it's extremely intimate. It feels, and honestly, I'm not really big into like sex scenes in movies, but I love scenes where there is a touch or a kiss or an embrace that's really, that shows a closeness and intimacy. I like that much better than any of the, naughty stuff. I tend to scan through those things because I'm an old person. You don't like to see, okay, you don't see it like that either. Good, Brooke. Okay, so, and so he puts her head and presses her face against his throat. So it's like a hug. She was very still. His heart, which seemed to have broken, was burning with a kind of agony in his breast, and he felt her slow, hot tears wetting his throat, but he could not move. And so he's just holding her. Only now it had become indispensable to him to have her face pressed close to him. He could never let her go again. He could never let her go away, her head go away from the close clutch of his arm. He wanted to remain like that forever, with his heart hurting him in a pain that was also life to him. I think this is so, and again, this is, I didn't write this story, so you don't have, you can hate it if you like it, but it's so sweet to me. And then, of course, he realizes that they stink. He says, suddenly he smelled the horrid, stagnant smell of that water. Oh. And then she is looking at him, but he was afraid of them, her eyes. And he fell to kissing her, not knowing what he was doing. And so then, of course, they're making out, you know. But again, they're both still covered in pond water. And she says, "You love me?" She said, rather faltering. So remember, before she said, "You love me." And now she's like, "Do you?" kind of thing. And he says, "Yes." The word cost him a painful effort, not because it wasn't true. So we know when he says that, this is what the narrator's telling us anyway, he was telling the truth. He's not lying. It's because it's too newly true. The saying seemed to tear open his newly torn heart, and he had hardly wanted it to be true even now. And there are times, I mean, I'm sure there are people who would say, I regret that I fell in love with somebody because they were, you know, it wasn't a good relationship, or it was, you know, I was just not ready at that point to have a great, you know, whatever. But, you know, for him, it's like, I didn't intend for this to happen. This is not the direction I thought anything was going. I didn't, it's not like I wanted this to, you know, it does change everything. It changes everything for him, and it changes everything for her. And so, you know, obviously it's a very, I like the fact even that she breaks out crying. So, you know, that, and he says the strange pain of his heart that was broken seemed to consume him, that he should love her, that this was love, that he should be ripped open in his way. And it's like people are going to make fun of him, you know, and this, of course, men are going to make fun of her, um, but it's worth it. You know, he says, "Why are you crying?" And she goes, "I'm not crying really." And then he finally can say, "For real, I love you, I love you." And so, and she's feeling now kind of self-conscious. So, you know, what are they going to end up? You know, one thing I asked in the journal is, how are they going to end up? You know, is it, and I've had people say, well, you know, they might be in a relationship, but it won't last because she's too needy. And the truth is, she did just try to commit suicide. So did they have therapy that she could really have used well at that point? No. In today's world, probably you know, I would suggest therapy to them, but I suggest therapy to any new couple. You know, if you're thinking, hey, I want to get married, therapy is a great thing to do before you ever get married. I absolutely think therapies, you know, especially a good therapist, can be really helpful to a relationship. Um, so what will happen now? What do you guys think? He has to go back to his surgery. He has to go back to his job. So his watch has stopped. Why? Because it got all wet. um, and he finally calls up the stairs. I'll have to go. And she's wearing black because of mourning, because of her dad dying. Um, and she says, I don't like you in those clothes. And he says, do I look weird? And she goes, and they were shy of one another. So they're going back to this sort of polite stuff. She goes, I'll make you some tea. He goes, no, I have to go. And she looked at him again with a wide, strained, doubtful eyes. And again, from the pain of his breath, she knew how he loved her. He went and bent to kiss her gently, passionately, with his heart's painful kiss. And she says, and my hair smells so horrible. And you can't love me. I'm horrible. Now, do you think people ever go through this where they, I'm not lovable? Yes. Where we have misgivings. And, honestly, the other person can say all they want. And we have to get to the point where we love ourselves too, not just we depend on the other person to give us the love that we need. We need to have self-love too. But he just says, he goes, don't, no, you can't, she says, you can't want to love me. I'm horrible, which is funny because those are some of the same words that he had in his head. But, I don't want this. I don't want this. It's horrible. He said that earlier, like last page. And he goes, don't be silly now. I want you. I want to marry you. We're going to be married quickly, quickly, tomorrow if I can. And that all he can answer is just, reiterate that. And he says, with a terrible intonation which frightened her almost more than her horror lest he should not want her. So there's a fearfulness in both sides. I just think, I'm looking forward to it. I'm hoping that they do get married. Maybe somebody in the papers will write a version of this later on, like an epilogue to the story. Where are they now? 10 years later or 5 years later or something. So, and maybe the brothers don't come to the wedding. And she's like, well, nobody came. And yet the townspeople did. And they're all like, happy that each of them has each other now. Who knows? So, I just don't know. But it would be cool. I'd like, I mean, I have a sense. Every time I read this, I have a hope for both of them that they can. I do favor happy endings. I just like them to be logical. There are times when, even in a movie, I don't know if you've ever watched a movie where the two people really hate each other and all they do is argue. And I think this would be a terrible marriage. And then they end up together and you're like, I don't know if I'm comfortable with that because they both need to work on themselves a bit first. Um, but these two, honestly, they're just lonely, and I get that. So I don't know. This remains one of my favorite short stories ever. So I'm glad I could spend so much dang time on it. Okay, but we need to start working on something else. So I'm going to go ahead and skip to The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. And I don't know, I'm going to suggest it, even though it has nothing to do, well, almost nothing to do with this story. It's funny because it was published in the New Yorker magazine, and yet the movie version, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, which has what's his name? Ben Stiller. Yeah, Ben Stiller is in it. It's called The Secret. It came out in 2010 or something. But Ben Stiller plays Walter Mitty in it, and he works for Life magazine. And so it's funny because Life magazine is one of those American staples. Well, so is the New Yorker. It's kind of one of those American staples too. And it's written by James Thurber, who tends to write comedic stories, and yet often they have some sort of thing going on too. Now, Walter Mitty, what kind of a guy is this dude? We have a lot of adventures going on in here, but what's Walter Mitty's real life like? And who is Walter Mitty really? Yeah, he's an older man, married to a kind of, I don't know what Mrs. Mitty's like, a bit of a nag. So she's, Mrs. Karen Mitty, if we want to go Karen on her, because she's very, I don't know, she's a bit bossy. Let's put it that way. She's highly opinionated. It's funny because there's an earlier movie called The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, and it has, oh, what's his name? Danny Kaye. And it's also good. But it's an old movie. In fact, it was originally black and white, though most of the versions you'd see once in a while are on TV are colorized. But in that one, it's his mom. Mrs. Mitty is his mom, and Walter's a younger man, so that he can have a romantic interest in. But in the story, this story, he's married. His wife is Mrs. Mitty. Okay. And what's his what exactly, in real world, where does he go in this story? Not in his dream world. So he's driving when we first get into the real world with him and with his wife, right? And she's upset that he's going over 55. And what are they going to buy? So he's dropping her off. Yeah, he's dropping off to go get her hair done, her weekly haircut or hair trim or hair styling, because this is back at the time when, and I don't know if your grandma's ever did this. My grandma did not. This is not my grandmother. She washed her hair pretty commonly and did her own hair, but a lot of women go once a week and they go and get their hair done at the hairdresser, and then they just wear like a hairnet at night, and they just kind of poof it up each day, and then go get their hair washed once a week. I could not. I do way too much working out to if I don't wash my hair every 2 days at least, if not every day, I go insane. But this is the typical thing. Women go get their hair done. And then while she's getting her hair done, he needs to get he has to get overshoes. Ah, yes, that kind of poof sort of dome hair. Yeah. And he has to go get um go get your overshoes while I'm gone. And why are you wearing your gloves? And da da da. And it's just it's just and it's constant nagging. Um, so at that point, though, of course, and it's honestly, there's very little to what he's actually doing. Most of this story is what the few interactions are with, like the parking attendant, the cop who tells him to get a move on because he's going too slowly. Um, and then he's walking along and just kind of in his own, but most of it, this is in his own head. Okay. And, yeah, he's supposed to go get puppy biscuits. And, and he says, I want a biscuit for small young dogs. And he goes, any special brand? Um, and then he says, puppies bark for it on the box. So, he's just remembering. It's like he's barely tuned in. Now, does this remind you? This was written long before we ever had cell phones, okay? But does it remind you of people in their phones today? Because it does me. The level of attention people don't give each other or give the situations they're actually in because they're so busy staring at their phone. Have you ever gone to like out to eat or something and you see a whole family and they're all sitting at the table together and yet they're not talking, they're just all on their phones? It's or you see a car and it's just like swerving down the road, like, and it's going 10 miles under the speed limit, and you're thinking, what in the world is this car even doing? And then you realize the person's on their phone, that I don't know if they're texting or what they're doing, but they're obviously not driving. Well, it's like, Walter Mitty is doing this, and yet he doesn't need a phone to check out. It is. It is sad. It is, it's actually very sad that his life is that humdrum and boring. Well, but the truth is little children are just like us. I've seen it before where a couple, with children, where they're talking to, the children or teenagers or something like that, 12, 13 years old. And they're even bossing their kid about, well, you're not paying attention because you're looking at your phone. And yet what's the parent doing? Parents doing exactly the same thing. And I hate having conversations with someone when they're holding their phone because I don't really have a conversation. But in this case, that same level of disconnect is happening to Walter Mitty, only he's just imagining it. And he is daydreaming all through the whole story. And his adventures are great. I mean, who wouldn't want to have these fantastic adventures? So we start out And he always has the pocketa thing going on. And that's from the car. We assume the car is actually clinking. And so, he's actually getting into this, so where is he in the first one? You tell me. So the commander stared at the ice forming on the pilot window. It's like he's writing his own. Yeah. So he's on a plane in the storm and it's like, we gotta go. And, and as he's flying through a storm, his wife interrupts and says, "Why are you driving so fast?" And so he's like, "Oh, well, I wasn't." He's not even paying attention. She goes, "You were up to 55. You know, I don't like more than 40. You were up to 55." Now, we don't know what the speed limit is. So yeah, pocket. Probably it's that. It's the car. Although he makes it kind of that running joke where every one of his little dream sequences has the pocket. And they use that actually in the first movie, the Danny Kaye movie, a lot. Everything has the pocket. And of course, what do? They show these scenes, these kind of soap opera like scenes, um, well, and when he fixes the machine with a pen, what's funny is that it reminded me of MacGyver, the old show, and you guys are probably too young for that. But there's an old show back in, I don't know, the 80s, and he all he needed was, get into some fix or whatever, and he needed, duct tape and a paper clip and something else, but and I'll just write this MacGyver in here. I'm sure you can find like on Hulu or something, MacGyver. It was such a fun show to watch because no matter what it is, oh, you've heard of him? Okay, good. Yeah, I guess it is MacGyver. It's probably I'm trying to get Guyver, but I don't know. I can't remember. It's been so long. But I watched it as a teenager, and we all loved that show. My whole family, we watched that show because he could get at anything. And it was just one of those things like, oh, all I need is we'd even joke, today, my husband and I both joke, well, all I need is a toothpick and a paper clip and something else, and I can fix it. Oh, it used to be on Netflix? Okay. Well, I bet it's on like, what is that, TiVo or Hulu or some of the other ones. See, and I love MASH. I loved, what was the other show I watched all the time? Hogan's Heroes. That was my big thing. That was so funny. That was way pre-MASH. Oh, Kung Fu was so good. Okay, you guys, I'm not talking about the stories at all. But the truth is those were, they fed our imagination. There were things that happened, that were really not really super accurate, but man, they were cool. And so, I still like watching Kung Fu stuff. I love Kung Fu movies still today. I love, there's so many good series right now that are like made in Korea and Japan and China that just have all sorts of martial arts in them, and they're just really cool. I especially like it when they're wizards and they can do sword fighting and they can fly. I love all that. That's super cool. But I mean, Walter Mitty, that's what kind of feeds his soul too. So he has a very active imagination. And honestly, given his life, wouldn't you rather be doing? Yeah, see, it's good. Oh, you have it on DVD? Oh, that was such a good show. Such a good show. My mom liked that one too. So we used to, yeah, she was always watching that one. I liked it. I mean, even the Incredible Hulk. I loved the old show. I watched it. I watched the old, what, the $6 Million Man, the Bionic Woman, the Wonder Woman I watched. All of that. It's all good. All good. So then he becomes a millionaire banker, Wellington McMillan. And he goes, who has, well, he's not a millionaire banker, he's the doctor working on him. So who has the case? Oh, well, these are the two doctors. And then they start, of course, does he know that much about medicine? No. I loved one. Linda Carter is gorgeous. She's such a pretty girl. And I just love the outfit. I loved all of it. I love the guy that she worked with, and how they make all the teeth gleam it was all good. All you people who haven't watched any of these shows and you're watching this video, just check them all out. They're all good. They're just so good. Um, and the doctors are all having trouble. Um, obstruosis of the ductal tract, whatever that is. Tertiary. Of course, we know, if you know anything about medical stuff, you're like, what? Um, oh, that was such a good episode. Jordan, you're just I'm going to have to go and look up Wonder Woman. I watched that so desperately when I was a kid. I thought that was such a good show. So of course they don't know, none of these works, streptothrombosis. I've read your book on streptothrombosis, which doesn't exist. And he's just making up all these fun words. So, of course, he's the expert on everything. Of course, a huge complicated machine is attached, connected to the operating table with many tubes and wires. And of course, it began at this moment to go pocketa, 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 just like the car. And so the new anesthetizer is giving way, shouted an intern. There's no one in the East who knows how to fix it, which is, none of this makes any sense. Of course. He sprang to the machine, though, which was now going pocketa, pocketa, queep, pocketa, queep. He began fingering delicately the row of glistening dials. Give me a fountain pen. I mean, this is fantastic stuff. It's so desperately dramatic. And wouldn't you, I mean, haven't we all had daydreams where, the bully at school, that we beat him up because we suddenly knew kung fu and we could beat him up, or we suddenly, we became the best speller in second grade and the teacher just, clasped her hands and shouted her adoration of how smart we are. We all have these types of things, but they don't dominate our lives the way that they do his. So it's, choreopsis has set in, again, another thing that doesn't exist. And he goes, would you take over, Mitty? And of course he's going to. If you wish. They slipped a white gown on him. He adjusted a mask. And they're like, come on, back it up, Mag. Look out for that Buick. And he's back in the present. And of course, it's just boring. So, looking for doggy biscuits, searching for, all that stuff is just not, it's not very, it doesn't make his life exciting. So instead, he's going to go and make his life exciting in his head. And the truth is, so he's looking for something, he's looking with the overshoes in a box, which he doesn't want to buy. She had told him twice before they set it on the, he can't even remember some things. And Guay hated these weekly trips to town. He was always getting something wrong. Kleenex, he thought. Squibs, razor blades, no. Toothpaste, toothbrush, bicarbonate, carborundum, initiative, and referendum. He's just making up words now. He gave it up. But she would remember, what is it that I was supposed to remember? What is I was supposed to remember? And then the newsboy starts shouting something about what the Waterbury trial, and he's back in Fantasyland. And now he's on the witness stand. Have you ever seen this before? Walter Mitty took the gun and examined it expertly. This is a Webley Vickers 5080. Whatever that is. And he says, you're a crack shot with any sort of firearms, I believe, said the district attorney. Objection, started Minnie's attorney. We've shown that the defendant could not have fired the shot. Blah, 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 blah. So he's in this big court drama. A woman's scream rose. All of the details are just fantastic. And he says, he goes, with any known make of gun. Oh, it's great. It's great. He goes, I could have killed Gregory Fitzhurst at 300 feet with my left hand. And everybody's like, oh, And then all of a sudden, a lovely dark-haired girl was in Walter Mitty's arms. And with the district attorney struck at her, and without rising from his chair, Mitty let the man have it on the point of the chin. You miserable cur. And of course he says the word cur, and he goes, puppy biscuit. And he remembers what he was supposed to get. And then she looks at her companion. This woman walks by. I think that's true. I think that's exactly why. I mean, and think about it this way. I can totally, I don't daydream like this. I don't have these weird fantasy things about being a lawyer or on a witness stand or a doctor, none of that stuff. But I think what he is doing is what so many of us do. I mean, and that includes with the phones, with books, with movies or shows, is we step out of our really humdrum world so that we can live something else and not have to think about. And sometimes it's worries. You know, when we were going through COVID, my gosh, my kids and I mean, and I had a friend actually with two kids about the same age as mine, and we did the same thing. Family night became every night, and we picked shows to binge. That's how we got through it. I mean, I actually became really dissatisfied. Social media became really hard for me during COVID because it became so toxic and negative, and I just couldn't do it. You know, anything people shared was all sad and depressed, and I just couldn't be reminded of that. Watching the news was depressing. Everything like that was depressing. And so we got into weird fantasy shows, weird, you know, stuff that we would never have watched otherwise. My son really got into Breaking Bad. I couldn't really do that, but we did. We're still trying to finish up Better Call Saul. And now we're on some weird Korean ninja sword fighting. I don't know. It's really cool, but it's completely not normal. Well, and I think what we realized is, yeah, we're pretty much homebodies too. So we used to go out maybe once a week together, you know, go out to eat or something as a family. And we didn't want to. And, you know, now we do maybe once, maybe twice a month, but not very often. And a lot of times we'll just go pick up food and come home. So I think it's a natural thing to do. The only problem is this is, it gets in the way of his living. And this is also a problem that we can use and apply to cell phones today. You know, when all you're doing is checking up with all of your Insta followers, or following people on TikTok, or Facebooking 8 times a day, or Twitter. I mean, you think of how many famous people Twitter literally do. Well, now it's called X. Don't get me started on that. But they'll tweet like 80 times a day. Yeah, New Girl is actually one of the ones we watched because it was funny enough. You know, I like stuff to happen, but I like humor. Um, I really wish Frasier hadn't been taken off because I would rewatch that entire, you know, all of its seasons. It was so funny. It was a break off of Cheers. But I loved Frasier. Frasier was, and I lived in Seattle for a while, so the whole snooty, this is how we order coffee thing is totally true. It is so absolutely true. And it really fit that place. You know, if you've lived in that area, there's a snobbiness to it that really fits. And so I liked all the characters in that. I liked the brother. I thought the guy was David Hyde. Was it David Hyde Pierce? I'm trying to think of who played him. So good. See, and I like the old Star Trek. I'm a huge old Trekkie fan. But I have other people who are big into the old, you know, the other stuff. So, but the truth is we've always had that. What it can't do though is, what it should do is inspire us to do more in our actual lives, not keep us from actually living. And that's one reason I suggest the newer movie of Walter Mitty, because with Ben Stiller, because it is giving that message. It's actually, we saw it with my husband's dad in the movie theater, and he has since passed away, but I still remember his response to it, that it was just it was telling you, go live your life and really go and live. And it's a very funny movie too, but it is so worth watching. If I could put together some sort of viewing thing with the class, I would totally do it. It's nothing like this, but it is. It shows him daydreaming and shows people even telling, hey, you know, you're spacing out there, dude, but in a modern world. And yet he's a very appealing character. And then he goes on his little adventure, but it's real. So it's kind of funny. It takes a lot of these ideas and does stuff with them. Was there any part of this that you didn't understand? So, I mean, you know, even at the end, you're like, you know, it says they went out the revolving doors. He's back with his wife, and she says, "Wait for me. I forgot something. I won't be a minute." And it says she was more than a minute. Walter Mitty lighted a cigarette. It began to rain. He stood up against the wall of the drugstore smoking. He put his shoulders back and his heels together. "To hell with the handkerchief," said Walter Mitty scornfully. So he's facing a firing squad. It's still one of, I mean, it's fun to read, and I think honestly, even though it's so old, you know, this was published, I can't remember when it was actually published. I need to, yeah, 1939. So it was actually during World War II. But and maybe that's why, maybe that fits, you know, when we're going through a lot of trauma, this kind of fiction is fun. But it's still, I think it's still relatable even today. And there are times when the world seems to be a dumpster fire, and it's really hard sometimes to face all that day after day. And so this kind of fantasy is a good thing, in my opinion. What do you guys think? I'm glad you liked it, Jordan. I hope you. Yes, it's and a distraction, you know, if you have homework looming or if you have big decisions to make, just distracting yourself doesn't take away the stress. I'm glad it's your favorite, Brooke. And hopefully, you know, if you watch the movie, if you really liked it, Brooke, though, I do suggest to both of you guys and anybody who's watching the recording, watch the film. It is so it's a recent enough movie. You should be able to find it on something, you know, and you can literally, we do this all the time. We find a movie and then we look up where can I watch, and then it'll tell me. So and we have subscriptions to a few different places, so we can almost always find it. But it's so worth watching, and it's not something that you have to worry about, even little kids. It's not like there's no gratuitous, you know, bad stuff in it. It's a family, it can be a family movie. Okay, thank you so much for being here. I think we got pretty much through the story, so we'll go on from there. But thanks, see y'all later. And if you have questions, stick around, but otherwise I will see y'all.